I guess we can go ahead and go then, right?
All right, and it's
I
recording.
recommend everybody have something to write on. This is mainly geared for students over maybe age 11 or above and their parents, but everybody will find it interesting. If you're younger than 10 or 11, find something to do with your hands while you're listening so the information can go in. Let me go ahead and introduce myself. Actually, first, let me tell you, thank you so much to Bonnie Sheldon and the board members of GCMTA for encouraging me to do this presentation and having this opportunity. I'm going to be giving this same presentation to the MMTA State Conference in the beginning of November. And if you are a music teacher, please avail yourselves of the digital material that will be available for the lectures at the state conference in November. I'm only one of many, many lectures, and they're going to be really great. So make sure that you take advantage of that. Let me introduce myself. I don't know all who's here, but I'm Emily Mailer. I am a Suzuki kid. I started violin at 22 months old, and I studied with Dr. Stephen Redfield through high school at University of Southern Mississippi, and I went to Vanderbilt University for college, majored in violin performance. And after that, I got my master's degree in Suzuki pedagogy and violin performance with Rhonda Cole at University of Maryland. I have taught violin for 23 years. And I am a Suzuki pedagogy teacher trainer. But my heart is really with my students in my virtual violin studio. I currently am living in Zagreb, Croatia, which is the capital of Croatia. It's sort of near like Italy and Hungary and Serbia and the Mediterranean. It's a beautiful Eastern European city. And I'm here teaching violin and dancing ballet. So for today, our agenda, I know that's very like cold sounding, but is to talk about the pedagogy of memorization. Why do we memorize? How do we memorize? When do we memorize? And getting what we can get from the people who really understand the nuts and bolts of memorizing. At this point, I just want to say, and I've said it before, there will be time for questions at the end. And I do really want to have a really great discussion at the end. But if you have something that comes up that's just burning between now and when I finish, please, please get a hold of Bonnie so we can stop and talk about your question, because I find those really, really interesting. I want to know what's on your mind as we're going through. If I'm going too fast, also just let me know. Before we really get into, okay, how do I actually tackle this like idea of memorizing a huge piece of music or a tiny piece of music, I want to talk a little bit about or investigate a little bit about why. Why do we memorize? Show of hands, well, actually this is not super useful. How about you just think inside of your head, how many of you music teachers memorize, ask your students to memorize their music at least 50% of the time. Say they learn this much music, but you make them memorize 50% of it. You can just think about it. And then how much of you make your students memorize 75% or 80%? I think that's a really interesting thing to say, okay, why am I choosing to have them memorize this? And why am I having to choose to memorize this? There needs to be a pedagogical reason behind memory, not just, okay, it's required, we're gonna do it because we have to do it. There has to be a reason behind any choice that we make as teachers or as parents in this triangle. When I talk about a pedagogical triangle, that's the teacher, the student, and the parent working together. And if you're an adult student, your student and your parent are both inside of you. So you're still a triangle, it's just you're two people if you're an adult student. Keep that in mind. So think about how you are, what is your why you are requiring your students to memorize, and why you require yourself to memorize things too. Because all of us as teachers are also performers at some way or another, and often we memorize. So any of my students in here will probably laugh a little bit because they've heard all of my reasons a million times before, but, and I'm gonna get to those in just a second. But I I'm interested. If anybody right now can tell me why they require their students to memorize. My mom, can we unmute her?
Oh, yeah.
I have my students memorize for recitals so that they can really be involved with the music in a way that they couldn't be if they had their eyes on the music. For one reason, if you are looking at, you kind of have the music memorized, halfway memorized, or even if you have it mostly memorized, if you have the music in front of you, there's going to come a place, maybe in the middle of the music, where you're going, oh, this is that place that, I always mess up on, maybe I better look up. And
Let me look up.
then you never look up. You don't know where you are, and it all falls apart. That's one reason. Another reason is through memorizing the music, you can interface with the music and find out more about the music and more about yourself in the doing of it. And I think Rico was weighing in, so I'll let him.
Rico's here. I didn't even see him.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi there.
Well, I just typed it in there on the chat. So basically, what I discovered is that the student will play better, and with all the focus and concentration is on the music making rather than, oh, what's the next note or what's the next section. So
Yeah.
that's the only point that I was making.
Oh, spoken like a Suzuki teacher. It's so funny. I have to tell a story here. In my master's degree program, on my thesis, I had to quote a whole bunch of articles from the Suzuki Journal, and I just like grabbed a whole ton and I cited a whole ton that were super inspiring, only to find out maybe a couple weeks after I submitted as I was doing my bibliography, I had cited Rigo 2 times. So thank you, Rigo. So Bonnie, can we hear?
I think Ariel had a question or had something to say.
I'm sorry, I had to relocate outside, so I've got all these stuff. So I know, kind of going off. Hold on, one second. So kind of going off the person before me, I noticed my students just do way better, like night and day difference whenever the music isn't in front of them. They seem to get really bogged down with the actual it being in front of them versus worrying about their technique or their intonation. And I'm really funny about intonation. And it could just be the level that they're at, but they just do better. So I kind of require it 100%.
Yeah, well, we're Suzuki students, and also many of the people in here are actually pianists. So Suzuki teachers, I know these pianists are balancing and listening to our Suzuki teachers and thinking, how does this apply to me? And I'm so glad you said that, Ariel, and Rigo too, that I want the pianists in here to realize that what we're talking about is more of a global pedagogical reason rather than a one method specific approach here. So let me go ahead now and say my reasons that I have. Well, one obviously is respected competitions require it. It is the real world. It maybe isn't perfect. Funny enough, MMTA does not require it for strings, brass, choral, and woodwinds, but it does require it for piano. I have no idea why. It's super not fair, but all of my students 100% of the time are required to walk in to that competition memorized, whether it's required or not. The reasons for this is page turns. We don't want anybody dealing with page turns. I know all of you pianists have a memory of taking a page turn, either ripping the page out of the book on accident because you're turning so fast, or ripping the book accidentally off of the piano. So we don't want to even have that added extra cortisol going into it, worrying about, is the book going to disappear? Falling pages off the music stand falling down, things like that. Also, and I think for competitions, the most important beautiful thing is that I want the judge to see your markings, to see my students' markings and my markings. I don't want that music in front of my student. They know what their markings are. I want the judge to see any bowings that we changed or any fingerings that we chose. Because when we choose a different fingering than the addition, it's usually trying to be a smart, careful choice. And I want the judge to see what went into that choice, not just the final product of that choice. So that's the first sort of logistical thing. What Ariel said and what Rigo said as well is our technique improves away from the page. Dr. Suzuki said, and I love this quote, is that we never teach a baby to read and speak at the same time. So to produce beautiful tone, we have to learn how to play the violin with a beautiful posture first, and then we teach them how to read the notes off the page. Now, I know this is not sort of super useful for pianists because you have to have the book in front of you. All I'm advocating for is try to get away from the book as often and as early as possible so we can focus on things like tone. And I joke with my kids, that's what we're paid for as musicians, is our tone, not for the fact that we can like produce notes in the right order. So we want to really take what Dr. Suzuki said really, really seriously and nurture the tone before we nurture the reading. What I said already is how we look is how we sound, and posture is paramount. But in addition to a beautiful, expensive tone, what we need to be focusing on is healthy musicians, healthy bodies. And I tell my students sometimes I can see someone who's been reading too much and too long from across the room, because there's a little bit of a tilt or a lot of a tilt here. And what you need to do is try to stack your vertebra from the base of your spine to the top of the cervical spine as well as possible to be able to make sure you're not getting anything off and starting to get an overuse injury. An injury-free playing is a huge predictor in eventual success. And healthy violinists, healthy musicians should be our very first priority as music teachers. And I do believe sometimes looking at a book too long and too much can actually mute our physical sensitivity to how we're feeling at the time. I also want to talk a little bit about the instrument-body connection. I'm not a Marvel comic girl, but I do kind of know that Iron Man had a blinky thing on his chest that sort of controlled his big suit, and it was connected into his suit, right? But it was also connected into his body. With a violinist, all I say is hug the string with your bow hair, or tell your bow hair to stop making that bubbly sound. They don't know what they're doing with their muscle or how many ounces of weight they're putting into the string, but they're developing a very profound connection between their body and their instrument. And I think when we have this visual input all the time, too much visual input can mute our other learning dominances, such as our ears and our sense of touch. So being able to have a sensitized sense of touch is really useful, but hard to attain when we're only getting information through our eyes all of the time. So find that sensitized connection between your body and your instrument, whether it's violin or whether you're playing the tuba. Doesn't matter. We can all find it. I also want to talk, that's us, and that's a very personal reason. But also let's talk about engaging with your audience musically. Many of us who have performed have a memory of that nirvana while we were performing, that moment of I'm flying. It doesn't matter. You're cut free from the world. You're looking down and you're like, this is incredible in the middle of a performance. And you're doing that because you allowed yourself to cut free from the bonds of what makes us human. And somehow you became into this ether. Getting away from the music allows you to do that. And it allows you to share with your audience in a really, it's like there's like a conduit that's attaching you to your audience at that moment. You have them in the palm of your hands. That's what we live for as musicians. That's what we train for every day. We're not training for, can I play all these notes in this order? we're training for, can I take your breath away? And as I take your breath away, can I take my own breath away? It's a sacrifice what we're doing as musicians. It's a sacrifice what they're doing to listen to you, because they're coming to you and hearing what you have to tell them. And the performer is peeling off their skin and saying, here is how I am. And this is what I worked for. And it's really, really beautiful. And to get there, getting away from the music so you can find that conduit is really, really effective and really also extremely important. But I do want to make a note here that memory is, of course, not required, and for obvious reasons in several ways. Choral music, orchestral music, chamber music, things like that. And I do want to make a special point to say violin and instrumental sonatas and sonatinas, it is actually also not required. And the reason for that, well, is because it is considered an ensemble. For example, the piano part in almost any violin sonata is way harder than the piano part is in, than the violin part is in the same piece. And so I remember I was 14 and I was learning a Schubert sonatina, and I was like, well, I'm going to memorize this. And my teacher at the time said, no, you're not. Because the piano part is so much harder, and you don't want to seem like the soloist, do you? You're an equal partner. He even said, it's actually considered rude to memorize a sonata or a sonatina. So last year I was teaching Kate, and I got her permission, one of my students, Kate, and I was said, you don't have to memorize your sonatina. And she's like, why? I said, because it's considered rude. And she said, well, I would never want to be rude, Emily. So that's why. It's just good etiquette. Don't memorize your sonatas or sonatinas, but anything where you are definitely the soloist and it's between you and your audience, I'm an advocate for 100% of the time memorizing. All right. Oh, whoops. There we are. So there is a wonderful book, and I recommend that any teacher read it. It's called Moonwalking with Einstein. I find this, it's not about music. It's about a man who said that he was a really bad memorizer. And he heard about these weird things called memory competitions, where people go in, and there's many different ways you can compete, but one of the standard ways is you get a stack of 52 playing cards in a random order. And the person who can memorize the order of those cards the fastest and then reproduce them for the judge, the fastest is the winner. And this man was a bad memorizer, and so he took, I think, a year trying to train his memory muscle to learn how to compete. And he won a memory competition doing this, an international memory competition. So his point is, you're not born a good memorizer or a bad memorizer. Being able to memorize is a reproducible skill that you can keep doing as long as you train that muscle systematically. He talks about memorizing pi. A friend of mine called me 2 years ago and said, Emily, I've memorized 275 digits of pi for fun. And I was like, why? Like, why would you ever want to do something like that? And then they told me how they did it. It's in this book. It's called Building a Memory Palace. You assign between the numbers of 1 to 9 a person, a location, and an activity that they're doing. So for example, it's Superman in the living room eating soup or whatever for each digit. And then all you do is tell yourself your story. And then you know every single digit you're looking for on your way. And so you've built a story with characters, with activities, and with locations that you're able to memorize. I'm not saying that works for music, but I'm saying it illustrates the point that as long as we're not just sort of busting through memorizing for just like knowing finger numbers and things like that, but we come through many different doors, it's a really, it's important to look at it in a really global way. Tunes, words, pictures, stories. When I was 5, I memorized all the color definitions of my Rainbow Study Bible because I was bored in church one day, and I still know all of the colors and all the definitions of my Rainbow Study Bible because I set a tune to it. And so it works for everybody, and you actually will never forget what you memorized if you do it that way. Okay, I would like, let's see. Okay, so many adults say that they can't memorize. I have a really exciting, wonderful section of my studio that's adults, and they're really great sports, and they teach me so much about teaching. And one of them came in. She is a beginner violinist. She's been taking for 8 months. She is a retired nurse anesthetist. She's 71 years old. She is an accomplished singer and an accomplished pianist. And 1 month in, she said she'd never memorized any music in her life, even though she's a wonderful pianist. And she said, Emily, it's just because I'm a bad memorizer. I'm like, no, you are a nurse anesthetist. You can't possibly be a bad memorizer. Let's see what we can do. And now she is almost over halfway through book 1 with the beautiful tone and the beautiful sound. And every single lesson, she's like, well, I just surprised myself. She's so cute and she's so inspiring. So I do want to say here, I'm talking from the background of a Suzuki teacher that believes that talent does not exist. And I know that many people maybe find that problematic. But I believe that when someone comes up to one of my students and they say, oh, you're so talented, I'm just thinking, they work really hard. We weren't born this way. We work really, really hard every single day just so we can show up and perform, and all of our audience thinks that we've always been that way. So it's important that we know that things like perfect relative pitch and memorizing and rhythm and things like this are not things that someone is just naturally born with or not born with, but someone is trained systematically to have that muscle. I think one person this time, but I would like to ask if any, actually, no, I'll make this a rhetorical question because I want to, in case, I guess I have an answer, but I want you to think the answer inside is, how do you remember memorizing as a student? Did you have a systematic method to memorizing? Because I know what my method was, and it was me turning up at my teacher's studio saying, oh, I think I have it memorized, and him being like, oh, let's hear it. And I would play it and it would be memorized and it'd be great. But what was I using to memorize? I was using muscle memory. Let's talk about muscle memory. It comes from the right brain. It's really, really helpful. Muscles are the first to memorize, and they are also the first to forget when we get nervous. And often it's the only way we memorize. So when you are having a memory slip and your student is having a memory slip, it's because their central nervous system is in overdrive and their muscles are saying, what, have we met? I have no idea who you are. And they just completely bail. So you need to let your right brain do what it's doing. Let the muscle memory happen, but you have to back it up with left brain information. Don't let it only be a house of cards, right brain, muscle memory, memorization. There are some pitfalls to memorizing that I think we should avoid. And I think a lot of us probably have students that maybe have had memory slips here and there, and they are almost always traceable to a reason. And I think that the first reason is memorizing too late in the process. We should start memorizing week 2 of learning a piece. The Suzuki method has them memorizing from the very second they learn, because I don't let my kids have the book in front of them. But when I'm talking about when the book is in front of them and it's not Suzuki literature, and for you guys, you pianists that you have the book in front of them, I would say start assigning memory bits starting in week 2, getting away from the music as soon as possible. When I have a student coming up to me saying, I tried all week, Emily, and I just can't do this. Usually it's one of two things. One is not enough repetition, and not small enough chunks. We're going to talk about that in a second, but it's almost always traceable why they worked all week. And my students they work really hard. All of my students practice between 1.5 and 4 hours a day. And so when they're coming to me, it's not because they're not working hard. It's because, oh, okay, let's take a step back and look at the system. What are you using to memorize? And then we need to stack the odds in our favor. And you need to make sure that you're seeing, okay, this is what I'm using. I know it works. You need to communicate to your kids that they're not a science experiment, that you're not, I hope this works on you, but you know that if you follow A, B, and C, you're gonna get a predictable, reproducible result, and they're gonna be able to walk up on that stage, having memorized using both brain hemispheres in a way that's going to stack the odds in their favor. How many of us have had the recurring nightmares of walking out for our senior recital and we have absolutely no idea what we're playing? I'm like looking at the program trying to see if I know what I'm playing right before. Most of us have had that nightmare. Almost every musician I know has had that nightmare. My mom has said she's still having those nightmares. I'm 37 and I'm still having them. So really, like, a lot of that comes from past mistakes, and a lot of it is just simply traceable to simply only muscle memory or only using one of your brain hemispheres. And we're going to get to that. So building the memory muscle, here is the practical how-to guide. I like to think of it as a recipe. It's a 10-step recipe, and it is simply, you follow these steps and you're going to get this result. It is the way it works. And if you're having trouble, go back and ask your students, are you doing this? How is this going? And then find where which of the chain links is not as strong. Wait a minute. Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say really quick a side note that practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. Perfect practice makes perfect, and that is terrifying. So what you want to think about when you're practicing and when your students are practicing is that you have 2 jars, and every time you play something right, you put it in the right jar, and every time you play something wrong, you put it in the wrong jar. And then when you have it, you have them stacked up a certain way. Now, the way many students memorize is they'll go through, they'll make a mistake. They'll go and make a mistake. They'll make the same mistake. They'll make the same mistake. And then they hit it and then they go on. So they have 5 repetitions in the wrong jar, 1 repetition in the right jar, and they go on. So what happens when they go into the concert is that they go to the jar that has the most repetitions and they pick out of that jar. So you need to make sure, again, stacking the odds in their favor, that when the way they are memorizing is filling up the correct jar 2 times as high as the incorrect jar, if that makes sense. And I don't like using the terms correct and incorrect. I'm not super into like negative commands like that, but that's whatever, blue and red jar, however you want to think about it. Okay, so here is our first step in our memorization recipe, and I already mentioned it. Start early in the learning process. Start by week 2. Unless you're a Suzuki teacher, never, ever, ever put the book in front of them, ever, ever. Memory slips often happen from starting too late. I don't know if LaTanya's on here, but if she is, she will know who I'm talking about. We had a pianist, a staff accompanist at Vanderbilt, Leah Bowes, and she was about 4'9" and about 70 years old, and she was an absolute monster on the piano. She could play anything. She was unbelievable. She was our staff accompanist. Everybody was doing anything they could to have Leah. And she worked with me during the whole time I was at Vanderbilt. And I remember one time her telling me that she went to Curtis. Curtis was her alma mater, and she went to Curtis when she was 16. Those of you who don't know Curtis Institute of Music, it's the most competitive music school to get into in America, and it's entirely full scholarship. Leah worked with Rudolf Serkin in the late 60s. And she walked into her first lesson at 16 years old, little 4'9", 4'10" girl, and he handed her a Beethoven sonata, the Waldstein, and he wanted it memorized by the next week. All the movements, not learned, by the next week, memorized by the next week. And she said, so I got home and I had a major panic attack, and I called my parents and told them I was leaving Curtis, and they said, no, you're not, you're staying there and you're gonna have that memorized by the next week. She said, Emily, would you know how that changed my life? Every 3 weeks I had to have a new Beethoven sonata memorized, and how that made it so she could get around the Fauré sonata and the Franck sonata and all that crazy accompaniment that those poor accompanists have to do for the brass players. It's all 20th century. She could get around it because she had all the tools in place from the Beethoven memorization she had done her 4 years in Curtis. All right, guys, you know I love cats. You also know I love ear training. Develop your ear training skills to shore up what you need to do for your memorization. Understand the harmony of your piece. It's harder for violinists to understand and recognize and appreciate harmony, but it's important that we do. Understand melodic contour and shape. Understand form. I teach musical form from the very first lesson when they're playing. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star is a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You have bread, which is the A section. You have peanut butter, which is the B section. The next B section is jelly, but it's soft. It's just like peanut butter, but it's soft. And what do you do to finish off your sandwich? What do you need? You need one more piece of bread. So you have A, B, B, A. They have no idea they just got their first lesson in formal analysis. We talk about building a roadmap, but it's so important to do a formal analysis on every single piece you teach from the very beginning. I make my students go through and identify all first and second endings and drill those endings separately, and then drill them into the piece and do a pop quiz. Second ending, first ending. Okay, now put it back in together, knowing where those endings are. Also, I require my students to identify trapdoors. So I don't know, I think I'm the only one who uses this term, but a lot of you guys will know what I'm talking about. Is when you're going through, say, Bach, and there is a, like, almost an identical twin part, but then there's one note different that will shunt you back to the beginning or shunt you to the end. They're all over Bach, and they're all over actually a ton of pieces, but you need to go through and identify them with a red pencil, because those trapdoors will come when you are nervous, and they'll be like, hey, no, this is the one you choose, and you're nervous, and you listen to like the very primitive part of your brain instead of being like, no, I circled you in a red pencil, and I know I'm supposed to play an F sharp here because a D will take me back to the beginning. Many Suzuki teachers know in the middle of book 1, there's a famous song called Etude, full of trapdoors. If you don't identify them, you will go back to the beginning. And it often doesn't happen until the kid gets into the performance, and they keep choosing the wrong trapdoor and going back to the beginning. And it can happen over and over and over, and the pianist follows them every time. And you just see on that student's face, I don't remember Etude being 10 minutes long. Help me get out of here, because you literally can play Etude for the rest of your life. So make sure, even with your 4-year-olds, you're like, this is this way, you go this way, and this way, you go this way, illustrating it like it's a map. When there's sight reading, pianists and advanced violinists, not Suzuki kids, not ones who are using the Suzuki books, they should label any mistake they make the very first time they make it on the very first sight read all the way through, because the one time they make a mistake, the brain lays down that information as that's correct. And then that will come back to become correct. The ear is like, oh, that's how you play it. So you need to label every single mistake. Don't just say, oh, that's just a one-time thing. Never, ever is a one-time thing. Label it always. Over-edit the music, even though you're not going to be in front of it all the time. The act of writing it down is going to tattoo it into your DNA a lot more effectively than just saying, I can forgive myself for that, and then walking on from it. Yes, I had a student, I think he's watching today, and I was talking to him about running in the desert and how rattlesnakes are territorial. And I spent a lot of time running in the desert before my ballerina life. And you always knew when you were coming up to a part where there was going to be a rattlesnake, because there was always a rattlesnake there, and it was always the same rattlesnake. And so you knew to be careful. You need to label your rattlesnake parts. You need to be like, this is the part I know that I want to choose the wrong trapdoor, or I want to choose the wrong ending. Beware here. You have to draw a rattlesnake in the park, do, but know those parts as you're going through. And just envision yourself as you're playing like you're going through a trail. And you don't have to be afraid. You know your way around so you can avoid being stuck. Okay? Okay. Find your escape routes. I spent 3 summers in Colorado performing at a festival in Steamboat Springs. And one of the teachers there had us learn our Bach all the way through. And after it was memorized using our right brain with our finger memory, she had us go last measure to the end, 2 measures to the end, 3 measures from the end to the end, 4 measures from the end. It didn't matter if it was an 8-page Bach C major fugue. We had to do it that way. The reason we had to do it that way is because she was establishing emergency evacuation routes in our head if we got tangled. All we had to do is go to the next measure and get out. So I think, especially in Bach, which is crazy hard to memorize, that we always give that gift to our students, is the knowledge of how to find those emergency evacuation routes. So drilling that 1 measure, 2 measures, 3 measures, always starting at the very end, not from the beginning. As a judge, I don't care if my kids have if the kid I'm judging has a memory slip. It doesn't bother me at all. What I care about is how they extricate themselves from the memory slip. Remember, as music teachers, we are not just teaching how to fingers and hands how to play notes. We're teaching life skills here. And they're going to get into a situation in life that they're going to have to extricate themselves with grace. And this is one of the ways that we are giving them the skill how to do that they don't have to panic, that they have already put what they need to have put into place in order to be able to get out. So this is really, really important, that they don't feel like they're up there with absolutely no recourse. Help them find those escape routes. Active listening. I require 1 hour of listening of my students at least every single day. And I can tell if they're not listening is super obvious, but they all listen. One of them said, "Hey, Emily, is it okay if I'm listening 3 or 4 hours a day?" I'm like, yes, absolutely. So yes, please listen, but not just passive listening, active listening with the score in front of you. That helps you notice those escape routes. That helps you notice the rattlesnake parts. It helps you notice all those first and second endings and all those trapdoors that you've already identified. It helps you see what the person is doing with their phrasing, how they're engaging with their audience, how they're finding that conduit between themselves and their audience. It's really important and super beautiful. Doing mental practice, really sort of sinking your teeth in the painful chords and the crunchy intervals, seeing what the composer is doing and being excited, like trying to see what did he want here and why was it important to him. You can do that through mental practicing. Maxim Vengerov, who maybe some of you guys know who he is. He's a Russian Siberian violinist. He was this child prodigy, and I think he was 14 at the time, and he was playing Sibelius Violin Concerto with the Chicago Symphony. And James Levine is his name. James Levine. No, Daniel Barenboim was one of them. Barenboim or Levine said, "You're missing something. You're just missing something, and you need to go home tonight." This was in the dress rehearsal, and you need to do some study on the score and see what you can change. And he was like, "Well, what's wrong?" He's like, "Well, nothing really. It's fine, except for you're missing everything. You're missing the point of the Sibelius Concerto." And so Maxim actually didn't even take his violin out of the case. He said he left it in the case. He took out his recording. He took out the score, and he said he listened to it and conducted it for 3 or 4 hours. When he got back, he said it was a whole different concerto. And that's what Barenboim was trying to do, was to push him into the next phase of, it's more than about just being a child prodigy. It's about, what do you bring to the music that's new, that's interesting, that shares something with your audience, not just about memorization, but about really being intimately connected to the music. Okay, this is my favorite slide. I worked really hard on this one. Okay, so how do we eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Many people can watch us performing a Bach fugue and wondering how are they learning and memorizing all of those chords? It's crazy. But like I said before, small chunks, high repetitions. So you should be memorizing in 1 to 2 measure chunks, but practicing them 20 or 30 times. Don't do it only without the music though, or you're gonna be causing a huge problem for yourself. It should be 5 on, 5 off, 5 on, 5 off. And when you're doing the mute with the part 5 with your eyes on the music, you are 100% eyes on the music, obsessing about the music, not saying, okay, I'll just look over here just for a second to test myself. No, because you're tattooing the music in your brain. And then you're going to go 100% without it. So you actually need to turn the music away. And then don't just say, oh, now I have it. Bring it back and do it 5 more and then 5 away, 1 or 2 measures at a time. I know 90% of everybody is going to go out there and do it in 4 measures. Don't do it in 4 measures. Do it in 2. Imagine trying to, you know how it feels? I went a long time without eating meat, but trying to eat like a huge bite of steak all at the same time and like get stuck here, it's the same thing. It's why parents cut their kids' pancakes into little bitty bites, right? It's because it has to be an easily digestible bit in order for them to be able to process it and assimilate it. It's the same for your brain. If a student is having trouble memorizing, this should be your first question. How big were your chunks? How many times are you practicing each chunk? And were you going back and forth between the music? It's not a very glamorous method, but it works 100% of the time. Only for us to be able to then go on stage and then to say, we're so talented. Okay, so it's important here, and everybody who really has heard me speak ever before knows that this is a huge obsession of mine, is the brain hemispheres. Engaging both brain hemispheres equally. Okay, so we talked about the muscle memory of the right brain. It's there, it's gonna happen. We accept that it's gonna memorize itself first. We're not trying to resist that it's memorizing, but we have to back it up with something else. So after we've used the right brain muscle memory, we have to come back also with the right brain and identify the shapes, the melodic contour, the texture, and the big picture. That's also right brain stuff. So we get the big picture, right brain, global thing out of the way first. We understand the contour, the melody, we hum it, we sing it, whatever we have to do. We use our right brain. We're musicians. We're almost all right brain. So then we do the uncomfortable thing for people who are musicians, and we use our left brain. And that is to build our roadmaps, to do our formal analysis, our harmonic analysis, and to, I just lost that. Analyze the harmony. Musicians are often much more comfortable in the right brain, which allows for the beauty and the creativity, and that's really, really nice to be able to live there. But if we are only one-dimensional in that side of the brain, it is a house of cards, and we have to be really, really careful. I would like to say here, many of my students know that I make them spell out finger numbers fast. So for example, the last piece in book 1 is the Gothic Gavotte. And there's a really famous part here where the fingers tie themselves into a bow, and then there's like a memory slip. Is decka 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 dum. And I make them say 1 3 2 3 4 3 2 1 A. 1 3 2 3 4 3 2 1 A. And then I make them go 1 3 2 3 4 3 2 1 A. 1 3 2 3 4 3 2 1 A, and do it in mixed rhythms. If they can speak it, it's firmly installed in the hardware of their left brain. But you have to be able to speak it and pronounce it with really, really like spitty consonants. So make sure that they say their finger numbers. I was walking and I learned Introduction to Erotic Appreciation by Saint-Saëns when I was 16, and I only had 6 weeks to learn it. And I was walking into the competition, and I remember telling my teacher at the time, I don't remember the last page. It's a really famous last page. It just flies. And I remember thinking, I don't even know what finger it starts on. He was like, how can you not know what finger starts on? It's been memorized for 3 weeks. And it was because I had lost I hadn't used the left brain at all. So I remember I think I had 20 more minutes before going in. I took my music and I started saying all the finger numbers, and it ended up being okay, but you should always do that. Spit out finger numbers. That will help you. That really does force it into your left brain. Okay. Okay, good. Okay, so incorporating physical engagement, including dancing and singing and vocalization. Any of you who have been fortunate enough to have or observe a lesson with Mrs. Naylor will probably have at one point had her take you in her arms and gallop you across her studio, careening across the studio at high speed while she sings Shall We Dance from King and I. I have seen her do it so many times, and it's so useful because you know what it does? It installs the feeling of a one pattern in a wall. Shall we dance? Dun, 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 dun. And you will never, ever, ever forget that. Doing something like that, dancing it or singing it, then puts it back in your right brain and helps you be able to not get too like a computer, but get it more into your body. And that's really, really important. I want to say here that there was a violinist who was a teacher in my summer program in Colorado, and he was wonderful. He's from Mexico, and this was structured so all the faculty and students were living on the same dormitory floor. We practiced in our room so we could hear each other practicing. And one morning at breakfast, the rumor was that he was going to learn Isaiah's Ballad, that starting on Monday and performing it on Friday. And we're like, what? You're going to do that? Like, how? And I was next door to him. I said, I'm going to listen to what he's doing. He hardly ever played his violin. He sang. He sang for hours and hours a day. And that helps you stay healthy as a violinist, and also is really, really effective to installing it into your brain. So maximize how you're singing. Also, if you take lessons with Mrs. Mailer, you know that she is constantly singing, and she is constantly asking the student to sing. And I'm constantly asking my students to sing. You should always be incorporating singing into your lessons. It saves wear and tear on the body, and it also is really, really effective. Okay, so the quote I paraphrased from The Martian, sciencing your way out of it. So you need to, I already mentioned the pronouncing the finger numbers. This is just basically recognizing that we have a left brain. Often the left brain is on mute. We need to actively encourage it to be able to back up our right brain memorization. You also should make friends with the metronome. After my students memorize, then I have them do it with the metronome. And it will often, they will feel like they have not memorized it at all at that point when they put in the metronome, even though they have memorized it. And the reason for that is because sometimes they are slowing down when it's hard and speeding up when it's easy, which is helping them remember it and produce it. And when you're having to produce it in the panic of being on the clock, it's a completely different type of memorization. So definitely make sure that you follow up within 2 weeks of them getting it under their belt by pulling out the metronome, which is very left-brained. So my Suzuki trainer, Rhonda Cole at University of Maryland, she's wonderful. One of the things that she requires of her students and required us to do as master's degree students was that they have to bring in a poem every week away from their violin, just learn the poem. And that's how they learn performance skills and communicating with their audience and being sympathetic to a story and reacting to it as if they're hearing it for the first time while they're performing it. Poems are also help you learn how to memorize. So I do encourage doing it. I wish I could do it more in my studio or at all. I did used to do it. But many people say, oh, it's just a lot to ask of someone. But I saw a 4-year-old do the entire Walrus and the Carpenter for her. It's a book. And I saw this little kid do it. And then one of mine that same year did the entire Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So it is possible to learn epic poems, and also you'll notice a profound difference in their playing and their mental skills after you start doing it. Okay, so Brennan's here. He said he was coming. I'm so glad he's here. So he's my like poster child for doing recordings, and it is like a secret weapon. It works. So what we do is that we have small chunk recordings, 2, 3, 4 measures, and Brennan submits like 4 recordings every single day to me, and they practice this chunk 20 times for about 20 minutes, and they get it to, like I say, Carnegie Hall level, and then they perform it for the camera, which simulates a little bit of stress. And then they send it to me, and it's not about getting feedback from me so much as it is about actually getting it to performance level and getting it out there. Then it puts it where it's really in the bank. Put WhatsApp on your phone. It's the easiest way for them to send recordings to you. And I mean, there's no other good way to do it. Do it on WhatsApp. I mean, there's other good ways. It's the easiest way. I haven't made Brennan do it, but I have made, maybe I did actually a long time ago. But the most effective way is to do it simulating under stress, the stress of being nervous. So running wind sprints outside, doing 20 jumping jacks, and then coming back inside and making a recording then, where your hands are shaking, they're wet, they're sweaty, and your heart is pounding. It's the same as being nervous, and then nailing your recording. That is when you really, really know that you can quiet the noise in your head and you can actually do what you need to do. The memorization, the notes, the connection, the musicality, everything, but you can do it under stress. So that's the recipe. Here's your challenge, teachers. I really would be interested in you guys memorizing a piece. I mean, when was the last time you memorized a piece of music? I was working on Preludium and Allegro the other day, and I was like, wow, it's been a long time. So memorize a piece of music. Notice how you memorize. What is the most comfortable way you memorize? And then notice it in your students. How are they memorizing? Ask them questions. That helps you get to the bottom of it, of what tools they're using to memorize, and then add to their toolbox. Memorize something that's not music related. I know it sounds super boring, but memorizing pi with the Memory Palace is really illuminating. My mom's favorite game when I was a kid was playing concentration, and that's really, really useful. Uses the same parts of our brain. Or take a dance class, because you have to memorize about 25 things in an hour of dance class. And it always makes me feel like I'm just going crazy because I can't keep anything straight. Doing something that's challenging. And then at the end, I wanted to say, do something that's not music related. Be a beginner at something, if it's pottery or acting or whatever, because it really starts getting that part of your brain open where you're starting to ask those questions of, how are my students learning? Because we can't teach from a place of being the expert, because that is a really dangerous place to teach from. We need to teach from a place of, I know as much as you do, and we're working on this together. So learning how to be a beginner at something, again, because we spend almost all of our time in being an expert at something, because we're music teachers, that's what we do. So it's really, really humbling, but also really, really useful. Okay. That's all. And I want to open it up for questions. But I think she sees you.
I am.
Thank you.
Encourage everybody to unmute.
Well, a couple of questions occurred earlier, and I should have been highlighting them as I was writing everything down. But I was really stunned what you said about using the metronome after you have memorized. That is going to change so much of what I do. Thank you. I will try that.
Wow. Okay. Yay. Actually, I was telling one of my students today that he was the fifth student in the last 24 hours to run his metronome out of gas in the lesson. So, because it's just been going, because we're getting close to a competition, my kids are, and it's like, man, everybody's got it going all the time. It's been really, really useful for all of us. Although I feel like I'm driving them a little bit crazy. It is really feels like, wow, I have completely like eaten my Wheaties that I need to when I put it in with the metronome after. You're right. Was that Alma?
It looked like there was another lady that wanted to weigh in.
All right.
I think Ariel, you had your hand up.
So I have a question for you. At what playability or level would you recommend introducing the metronome? Because that's been a major struggle of mine as far as when you think your student can handle it and it doesn't like overwhelm them.
Really, really good point. I often introduce the metronome as early as perpetual motion in Suzuki 1, but I do not throw them into the deep end. We do one measure without any music. We'll clap it with the metronome first. We'll clap and sing it with the metronome. We'll do the first 4 notes with the metronome together, 8 notes with the metronome. And then after that, they just take off. They don't need me after that. But you have to sort of like go in shallow end and know that it is like, like, you know, when you put those little socks on a dog and then they have to go outside for the first time, the ones that protect their feet from the hot pavement, and they're like this up, and that's how people first react to the metronome, and that's totally normal, but you have to slowly walk them in and do it in really big little chunks. That's always the first question we ask. Really, that's the answer to almost any teaching issue is, how big of a chunk was I asking of them if there's a problem? Anything, even if it's a behavioral issue. How big was the chunk? And then usually just make it smaller. And often it fixes everything.
Emily, I had a question. You mentioned about sending your students sending you recordings of maybe 3 to 4 measures, and all. What you mentioned, is it just the record app like on their phone that they're using function, or it seemed like you said something specific, some way that they were recording it, and I didn't get that.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, it is just make the normal video on your phone, just like you video anything on your phone, and you'll save it to your phone library. Then use the app WhatsApp. Every single person in Europe has WhatsApp. And hardly any Americans
WHATS?
Yes, and then APP.
Okay.
It's the easiest way. I require my whole studio to have WhatsApp on their phone. That's how they text me. It's a free texting app, but also it's a super easy way for them to send videos to me. And most of my students actually submit videos to me on a regular basis.
Great.
And I don't always respond to them. And that's like something I really wish I could get better at. But they know that I'm watching the videos. And then sometimes, like, well, who was I think it was Brennan again, that like he had like backed up like 6 videos, and I just responded to every single one all at the same time. And so but it's not about the response. It's about the fact that they're putting themselves under the pressure of a miniature performance.
Bonnie,
yeah,
I have an observation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Unless somebody else is raising their hand.
No, I'm not seeing anybody else comment or raise their hand on anything yet.
All right. On her comment that your right-brained muscle memory must be backed up by left brain information. My first experience with this was when I was in the 8th grade and I was playing a Bach invention on a recital, and I had played that perfectly just countless times, but I was so excited. I was sitting there waiting for my turn to play, and I was thinking, I am going to guide my fingers to every note and make sure I don't play in any of the cracks, and I'm going to be on top of this. Well, what trouble is, it was only muscle memory, and the idea of guiding my fingers. Oh, dear. Yes.
That sounds like in Princess Bride when he's like, guide my sword. He ends up on the tree. But I've had this actually experience. Actually, guys, this is my mom who's talking. And we were playing a Mozart concerto, and I think I was 15. And I had another one of those moments right before. It was right before we walked on the stage. I was like, Mom, I need my music. And she was like, what are you talking about? No, you don't need your music. You've done this a bunch of times. My mom was my pianist all the way up until I graduated from high school. And so, and a lot after that. And she was like, I was like, well, I can do it if I just don't think. And she said, okay, well, whatever you do, don't think. And so what I was trying to do was going on that stage was thinking about anything else, and my cat and my little brother and what's that blinky thing in the back of the corner, just so my left brain could, my muscle memory could just take care of itself. But man, was that thin ice that I was skating on.
I believe Ariel had a question.
I didn't have a question. I'm sorry.
But we do have another question here. Is this, yes, we have another question.
So Emily, I am hard of hearing, but
Yes.
I read lips. So in March of 2018, I had surgery to repair an aneurysm, and there was a complication and I had a stroke. I'm also in my 30s. So I lost my hearing. I was completely deaf for 5 months. I played the clarinet, but I lost my vision as well. My eyes fell, my right eye rotated. So the double vision was so far apart, and I couldn't hear, and I had one eye closed because the double vision was too great to stand. And I went through recovery in Atlanta. It was amazing. I was away from home for 3 months, but during that time, I made leaps and bounds. God has blessed me in the most miraculous way through this. But when I came home, I still couldn't hear. I mean, completely deaf, could not hear myself, could not hear anything. So I went to vision therapy in order to correct my eyes. I've never worn glasses before, but I went to this therapy, and it's a specialty eye clinic. And while they were doing the therapy, he would put these glasses on that had angled lenses to make you see double. And he would either make you see in or make you see out. And it was telling your brain something's wrong with your vision, fix it. So my brain would slowly try to correct the poor vision, and that gave me better vision. With prism glasses, it's allowed my eyes to make one, because I couldn't make one image. I'm driving now, which is
Wow.
but the biggest thing is the connection between your audible and your visual stimuli is so great, because as I started to make one, I was able to hear.
Yes.
So I was able to get a little bit of my hearing back. And the more therapy I did, the more I could hear. And it just dumbfounded my doctors. He travels to Poland to teach about this kind of recovery, visual recovery. So he's an amazing doctor, but it stumped them because they said, I don't understand why you can hear so well, other than obviously God's healing me. But he described it like data in a wire. He said, basically, you have so much bandwidth that allows for the visual stimuli to get to your brain. Yeah. So when you're driving in a car and the radio's blasting and you say, turn that down, I'm trying to see.
Yeah.
Absolutely true, because if you have too much going in visually, you can't hear.
Exactly.
And so you're on the stage and you're about to play and you allow the visual stimuli to take up too much of that bandwidth, you can't hear what you're doing.
Right. And sometimes we, when we only have our left hand that knows what we're doing, we don't want to think. We don't want the bandwidth. But I would be interested in knowing, one, what was your learning dominance before your surgery? And what was your learning dominance after your surgery? Because I don't think your learning dominance would have changed. Whether you were a visual, an auditory, or a kinesthetic learner is really, really, really important. And also, two other things that I thought of when you were saying your incredible story. It was absolutely incredible. Like, wow. And you're like a living and breathing like illustration of what we're trying to talk about here. And thank you so much. In Dr. Suzuki's manifesto, Nurtured by Love, which is an easy read, and I recommend every single person read it, whether they're a piano teacher or a violin teacher. Nurtured by Love. At the beginning, he speaks about a blind child coming in to take violin lessons. This is in the 40s or 50s. And how could he teach a blind child how to play violin? And it was to be able to find another sense that didn't exist, and to be able to have this child play, that he didn't need one of his senses in order to be able to play. It's not that he only used his ears, that he only used his sense of touch, is that he had something else that was indefinable. And all of those of us who are violinists know that anytime we're near our instrument, we sort of get this really weird sixth sense too. And we can sense that our instrument is close to us. So it is real. It does exist. This sixth sense exists. About muting part of your brain in a way that's useful or in a way that's not useful. Having an ability to flip that switch on and flip it off at will is a really good skill to have. There is a wonderful book. Most people are required to read it in music school. And I think my mom said she read it in the 70s, and I had to read it, and then I forgot about it, and then I read it again when I was having trouble with with pirouettes and ballet. And then a student remembered it a couple weeks ago. It's called The Inner Game of Tennis. And it's about Buddhist thought, but it's every musician is required to read it, and it's about tennis, but it applies to music, and it's how to be able to control those switches in our brain. How can we turn them on and turn them off in a way that's useful in order to be able to execute a task that we want to execute? So we have a lot of homework for reading. Moonwalking with Einstein, Nurtured by Love, Inner Game of Tennis. I usually have like my usual suspects of books to recommend, but this is a different, if you've heard a lecture of mine before, these books are not on that list. Oh, except for Nurtured by Love. It's like everybody has to read Nurtured by Love. So, Bonnie, do we have anyone else?
I'm not seeing anyone else raise their hand.
Okay. I see a hand.
Oh.
That's me.
Oh,
Carol.
Oh, okay, well, go for it.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I have a question, and I'd like to conclude maybe with this question, unless anyone else has one. Things that occur to me as you have been speaking of ideas that could be useful for future programs. And one was Ms. Perez's weighing in here as she has. That has just opened up huge fodder for consideration for a program. And how about dyslexia and memory? How about how to maintain the dialogue? And you were touching on that just now. Maintaining the dialogue between the right and the left hemispheres in performance. In a performance, it's like down boy, down boy. How do you referee those during a performance? And I'm sure you have mentioned that you'd be willing to do continued presentations like this under our banner. What an honor. Thank you. This has been so wonderful. And I can't wait to learn, get feedback from the people who attended, and with any other ideas possibly for future things they would like Emily to speak on.
I know I have a couple of students that are on spectrum for autism, and so sometimes I have a little bit of issue on him. Like, I approach their teaching different from other students, and I also have students that are dyslexic and ADHD. So I've got a interesting group. So I'm definitely interested in anything you have that you could like throw my way.
Well, my thesis was on learning disabilities and teaching violin. So I have done a lot of work with just people, not necessarily disabilities, but like differently abled learners. And I do consultations with teachers who often they can record their lessons. If there's a trouble lesson, they'll record it, they send it to me, we meet, we troubleshoot, we talk about what they can do differently and how questions that they can ask, things like that. I do stuff like that. But I hope that we can do more pedagogy training sessions like this going forward. Pedagogy, I mean, obviously I'm a huge pedagogy nerd. It really makes me tick. And I really, really love the science, the why of teaching and what makes brains tick. So, and every brain is different. So so definitely, and Ariel, who asked that question, was one of mine until she graduated high school. Anyone, former students and anyone who has never worked with me before, my door is open for pedagogy advice and training sessions as well.
So Emily, I just made a message on the chat for everyone, encouraging them to share their email with our GCMTA email, or for them to share their email with me, so I could maybe put them on a list if we have other talks, or if they have ideas and want to give us some feedback for this talk.
Sounds good.
That way I can share it with your mom, all their feedback, and then if we want to do more, then they can be on an email list to get the announcement for a meeting.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Bonnie, for doing that. And thank you so much, everybody. Well, thank you, GCMTA. Thank you, board. And thank you, Bonnie, for putting this together and making it happen. And thank you, everybody, so much for coming and listening and coming with your questions and everything. I appreciate it so much.
Well, this may seem Emily,